welcome everyone. We will get started shortly, but I would like to give you a few more minutes, a few more seconds and to settle down and to get your audio preferences ready before we start. All right. So welcome to today's webinar. Before I hand it off to the presenters, I just want to go through some technical details just in case you have not joined Acro webinar in the past. We use Zoom webinar, which is similar to Zoom meetings, except that your cameras and your microphone is turned off by default. You have two different ways to interact with your panelists and with each other. One way is the chat button. Make sure you do select everyone if you want to communicate with everyone. And the other one is your Q&A button. That is for questions that you have particular to today's presentation. You can ask your questions anonymously, and you can ask them at any time. And before any further ado, I will have Kevin, your moderator, get started.
Thank you, Belma, and thank you to the Acro team for organizing this webinar. We're excited to be here. I have with me Melissa Goldberg and Deb Everhart, who will introduce themselves shortly, but my role at Parchment is I get to work with our higher ed members. So you may have seen my name on an email before, and we just really appreciate you joining us. The topic of today's webinar is the recognition of skills and how they pave paths to employment. This is a topic that is, I think, hotter than ever right now. It's kind of ebbed and flowed over the last few years, but it continues to have increasing attention from employers, from higher education organizations, boot camps, and the list goes on and on. And so we brought two experts in the field who had to spend a tremendous amount of time thinking and talking and writing about this topic in their organizations as well. And so I would love for them to introduce themselves. If you do have questions for the Parchment team, you can do info@parchment.com. You can go to our blog as well. But I'll start with Deb. If you could just briefly introduce yourself, a little bit about what's in your portfolio, and then most importantly, what was your favorite ice cream when you were a kid? And what is your favorite ice cream now? And then when Deb is done, if Melissa, if you could go, that would be great. So Deb, I'll turn it over to you.
Hey, thanks for including me here today. I'm Deb Everhart. I'm Chief Strategy Officer at Credential Engine. And I also have a long history in open badges, working in that field since the very beginning, and other things that are empowering for individuals, including, how they can articulate their own skills. For example, I led the development of a couple of white papers at the American Council on Education on quality dimensions for connected credentials and communicating the value of competencies. So been in this field for quite a while, but I'm extremely excited to see how rapidly things are evolving right now. Ice cream. So when I was a kid, my favorite was peppermint stick ice cream from Blue Bunny. And one of the reasons it was such a special favorite is it's seasonal. You could only get it at Christmas time. So we anticipated that. I would say that's still one of my favorites, is some variation on peppermint ice cream, but it's not very easy to find.
That does sound like a unique flavor. Well, thank you, Deb, and welcome. Melissa, over to you.
Oh, thank you. And thank you so much for including me today. So I'm Melissa Goldberg. I am the Director of Competencies and Credentials at Corporation for a Skilled Workforce. And I have been working in higher ed and focused in on skills and credentials for many years. I spent some time in launching College for America at Southern New Hampshire University, a competency-based a set of degrees and certificates focused on working adults. I've spent time working at community colleges, leading workforce efforts, all connecting skills to work. And now in my portfolio, I'm really focused on advancing the use of competencies and incremental credentials to make sure that individuals who've been left out of the labor market have access to the what they need so that they can articulate their skills and advance their careers. In terms of ice cream, I would also say I've been consistent since I was a kid. When I was little, it was always coffee ice cream in a sugar cone with chocolate sprinkles. So I've matured a little bit and gotten rid of the chocolate sprinkles, but coffee ice cream is still my favorite. So
That's fantastic. I feel that in my ice cream choice, I feel very immature in that mine was tiger tail as a kid, and it was orange sherbet with black licorice. Which sounds really gross, but you like the idea of things when you're young, right? Like we do now. And now I'm really boring. I just like butter pecan and vanilla. My kids tell me that it's very boring, so that's life. And Parchment's interest in this space is, you know, our mission is to help turn credentials into opportunities. And when we think about what credentials represent, and how they represent what a learner knows and how well they know it, this is a really big part of the portfolio of activity that we do on the high school side and in the higher ed side, which is two markets that we spend a lot of time working in and thinking about. So maybe Deb, if I could start with you, can you tell us a little bit about a credential engine and how your organization thinks about the recognition of skills? And then Melissa, the same question to you when Deb is done.
Yeah, sure. So Credential Engine is a nonprofit, and we advocate for credential and skill transparency. And we support that work through policy, through work with a wide variety of partners, state and federal agencies, global organizations, other organizations like Corporation for a Skilled Workforce and Credential As You Go, as well as product and service providers like Parchment. Our technology infrastructure includes two really key components that you'll hear me refer to a lot today. One is the credential transparency description language, which is an open schema for describing all different types of credentials. So degrees, certificates, badges, licenses, certifications, apprenticeships, etc. Skills and competencies of all sorts, as well as jobs, pathways, transfer value, and some key things like that, using this schema so that everyone is using the same data structure so that all this data can work together. And then all this data can come together in our open, freely available registry, where any owner of these competency, skill, pathway, job data can publish it to the registry, and then is publicly available for everyone else to link to. So it's a linked data network that enables many different types of collaboration that you can't do with data that's all in a single or siloed system. What we don't do, we do not issue credentials.
So you do everything else other than that.
Well,
No,
we're pretty very narrowly focused on CTDL and the registry and advocacy around those things. So
we are huge fans of Credential Engine at Parchment and the work that you all are doing. And also you noted the standardization, which is I think is a recurring topic in so many of these credentialing conversations, but I think the work that you guys are doing is wonderful. Melissa, the same question to you.
And I'll have to echo that as well. The Corporation for Skilled Workforce, we're also huge fans of Credential Engine, as you know, Deb.
Mhm.
So CSW, or Corporation for Skilled Workforce, we're a 32-year-old nonprofit focused on really catalyzing change in education and labor market systems, policies and practices, all with the goal of increasing economic mobility, particularly for people of color and for others who've historically been excluded from labor market success. And so we do this by diving deeply into 5 practice areas. We work with workforce nonprofits to effectively use data to improve practices and outcomes. programs. We engage in policy and systems change discussions at the federal, state, and local levels. We research labor market information and evaluate program outcomes. We address trauma and resilience at work, which is a newer practice area. And then the piece that I lead is all around looking and advancing the use of competencies and credentials in the workforce and higher education ecosystem. And so we really believe that advancing the greater use of skills and competencies is going to provide for more effective and equitable system, providing learners with the language that they need to be able to really talk about what it is that they can do with what they knew. It's a common language that employers can easily identify needed skills, and educators can use skills and competencies in order to help demonstrate what the outcomes are that learners have coming out of their programs. So
that's great. Yeah, what you all are doing, I think, particularly on, I mean, not solely, but particularly on the equity side, is incredibly valuable. And I'm excited to see the work that you continue to do. Speaking of two other organizations that are heavily involved in thinking and writing and communicating about this, so ACRO has an alternative credentials work group, and Education Design Lab did some work as well, all around skills and alternative credentials. And in both instances, the authors discussed skills and competencies almost interchangeably. I'm not sure if either of you read those reports, but in both, like, the thing for me as I was reading them was trying to distinguish the difference between skills and competencies. I'm going to ask you to do something very controversial, which is, in your experience, what is the difference between skills and competencies? And so, Melissa, we'll start with you, and
Sure.
Deb, then we'll go to you.
Okay, well, it is a great question, Kevin, but I'm going to push back on you a little bit and sort of ask, does it matter? So I'll just say, look, on the one hand, I have seen skills sort of defined in different ways as being more around a specific ability that somebody has, or, one component of completing a task. I'll also tell you that at CSW, we define competencies as describing what a person knows and can do. It's observable, it's measurable, and it's occupationally relevant. But I really feel like it's important to recognize the context within which you're having this conversation. And so earlier this year, Credential As You Go, which is a national initiative in advancing the notion of creating a fairer workforce education ecosystem through the use of incremental credentials, and CSW is one of the leads of Credential As You Go. We hosted a summit on language and really took a look at this question. And really one of my biggest takeaways out of that conversation was that these terms are out there, they are being used interchangeably, and what's more important is to consider, when you're having these discussions and conversations, to define those terms. If you're using the term skill, if you're using the term competency, or any other proxy for those, to make sure that you have agreement in the room or among those that are part of the discussion about what that definition is, and then use that to move forward. And that's why I sort of push back, because I don't think we're going to ever get to a place where everybody agrees on what those definitions are. And it's better to make sure that we know, as we're having these conversations, what we mean and defining those terms within the context of that.
All the freedom that comes with that response. I think that's a very freeing, like, it doesn't pin you in, it gives you the flexibility. Deb, how about you?
Yeah, so bravo to that. But one caveat, so when you are working in context and need to define, well, what do we mean when we say skills? What do we mean when we say learning objectives, learning outcomes, KSAs, tasks, right? Please don't get bogged down in that, because you can bring together a set of people who are trying to do important work, and they can spend all of their time just trying to come up with those definitions. And so just to, one way that we have addressed that is to basically not address it. So in the credential transparency description language, they're just called competencies. And there are ways where if you need to, want to, you can label them differently as these are skills, these are competencies, these are tasks. So you can do that within CTDL, but you don't need to. So we think that many organizations are in what we call the turning on the light stage.
Yep.
Just get those competencies out there so that you can see them and so that others can work with them. And to do that in the registry, they're all called competencies. So you don't even need a definition. You just put them all in the competencies.
Yeah, I appreciate the thoughtfulness with which you both answered that, and it's almost a burden or a hurdle that gets in front of institutions if you begin to define them, because maybe it's going to prevent some organizations from moving forward because they get hung up on trying to define both, or if they do successfully define both, it then prevents them because it's it's a boundary that's too high to move beyond, or just slows down the institutional inertia, which in higher ed in particular can have a pretty meaningful impact. When you think about institutions and organizations that are explicitly credentialing skills and or competencies or working in this space, do you have any examples of who's doing that today, or at least in the context of your organizations? And then also, just to pair with that, kind of who's doing it and what's driving them? And it might be all the things that you've talked about in terms of generally, but yeah, who are they and what's driving them?
I'm happy to jump in there.
Please.
The state of Alabama has made a decision that they are creating a competency-based talent ecosystem for the state, and doing this by developing different applications, one targeted at employers, one targeted at the workforce system and educators, and one targeted for individuals to create their digital wallets and their learning and employment records. And the DNA behind, also they refer to it as a talent triad, and the DNA undergirding all of this are competencies. And so they've started by creating competency-based occupational profiles, which we at CSW helped them to create. And then they're using that in the system so that they are able to then come up with common language for educational programs and for individuals in the workforce system as well. And I think a couple of other places I can just talk about through, as I mentioned, Credential As You Go. We're working right now in 3 different states, in Colorado, in New York, and North Carolina, and among them in 21 higher educational institutions who are all building different sorts of incremental credentials. And in many cases across those institutions, they're looking at skills and competencies as that language to kind of be able to build, say, stackable credentials, or look at prior learning, or those sorts of things as well. And I think the motivation for a lot of these efforts that are out there is really to create a more equitable system. And really providing opportunities. I think also, though, really looking at the rapidly changing labor market. I mean, even as our economy is changing, employers still are challenged to hire people with the skills that they need. Jobs are changing, and so people need to upskill and reskill quickly. And learners have sort of expressed this need for an opportunity to be able to clearly demonstrate what they know and can do. And I think all of that is sort of under a lot of this.
Yeah. To the last point that you made there, IBM did a study recently that 120 million Americans will need to be retrained in the next 3 years to maintain or just adjust to the employment market. And that is just a crazy number when you think about what that means. And the organizations that are represented on this call either to facilitate that type of learning directly or to help create the structures around it so that that learning can be communicated in a material and meaningful way to employers on behalf of learners.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah.
very good. Deb, this is same question for you, if you could.
Yeah, so I'll come back to the question in a second, but speaking to, for example, the higher ed providers who are listening to this, there's also some crazy, scary statistic about a significantly high percentage of jobs. So people who are in college today, who are traditional, 18 to 22-year-old population, some high percentage that I won't get right, but I think it was maybe 60% of the jobs of the future don't exist yet. So if you're a higher ed institution, your hands are tied. You're very limited in terms of how you can help someone prepare for that type of career that's going to be that different from where we are today. And so I think it's just absolutely necessary that we all understand the skills that people are learning wherever they're learning them, whether it's higher ed or CTE or on the job, apprenticeships, because everyone's going to need to mix and match those skills into new careers and multiple career changes. So, but then let me get back to your question, because I think one of the general categories of organizations that is doing the current skills work well is industry certification bodies and industry bodies of various sorts. And that's because that's what they've done sort of all along, right? And so they by definition have been more targeted toward industry skills, and their certifications are basically assessments that someone has those skills, so that a respected certification, you hire someone who has that certification or some set of certifications, and you're like, I know what that person can do because I know what the skills are that they were assessed on, right?
Yep.
So that seems too easy, but it's still pretty hard to actually be able to have the credentialing processes, to have the transparency around the skills, and importantly, not to have that all be siloed. So let me just show you a couple of examples that are also going to help you understand what CTDL does, which these are all different industries, right? So there's the National Retail Association, and by the way, you'll see in that example that they have not only competencies, but also pathways. There's SHRM for human resources. There's, let's see, another one I was gonna, NOCD, this is a good one. And so these are examples of industry certification bodies that have certifications that include skills, competencies, whatever you want to call them. And they've all published their data to the registry so that when you go in there, you can see the relationships between the competencies and the credentials and the assessments, as well as a lot of other information that is all available in the same data structure. So for example, some of the skills that you would get in retail are applicable in HR, right? And so if you've got NRF skills and you're moving into HR, you should be able to have transparency about what those skills are and understand them all in the same data structure like this, so that you as a person or a system can help you understand the relationship between those two different areas of work.
Yeah, you're, as with all of these sessions, there's you do dry runs. I've learned that the new phrase for dry run is workshopping. We did not workshop the following question, so I'm gonna go a little off book. If you say I'm not sure, that's okay. But when I think about those skills being represented here and who they are for, obviously you talked about the learner. the employer is ultimately the one who is most interested in that and pulling that out around specific learners and getting a sense of it. Do you have a sense of, like, our HRIS systems starting to draw this information in? I mean, this is a huge, there's like this big, like there's information that's continuing to get pushed out there, right? And it's happening in a progressively more standardized way. But that consumption side, how is that space looking generally? Do you see bright spots, or is it still a dark room right now with just little candles that are lighting? And either of you could jump in.
I mean, I'll start, and I can't give you specifics of bright spots yet. I have seen, unfortunately, that has been a big challenge to sort of advancing this notion of skills-based hiring, is that people get screened out because the AI in these systems are sort of saying, oh, no degree, okay, get out of there. I am reading about much more sort of acknowledgement that this needs to be fixed, but I also think that many of the legacy systems have just been built based upon older systems, and so it takes longer to make that change, and it's a slower change. But I don't know, Deb, you might have another opinion about that, and if you're seeing advancement.
Well, that's generally true. It's true for education systems too, both K-12 and higher ed. But let me share a couple of resources that are really good work in this arena. So if you're not familiar with the T3 Innovation Network, this is a body of work and community built organizations that are working across skills and how they're defined and shared, and working in the arena of how data standards are mapped to each other, for example, to be able to map student information systems to HR information systems, and also to actually be able to connect the dots in the learn and work ecosystem. So this is a really great body of work, and it's all of the use cases and all of the sticking points now across those education and HR systems, right? And this is a glass half full, glass half empty kind of report, because it does a really good job of laying out the landscape and where the opportunities are, but it also shows where some of the blockers are. And then I'll share also some work from another nonprofit. So T3 Innovation is all nonprofit work. Velocity Foundation is also nonprofit work. So what they're doing is they're working directly with HR vendors and have developed, getting adoption now of a verifiable credentials, learning and employment records infrastructure. And so this is not widely adopted yet, but I think it will probably get going pretty fast because there's so much demand for this. I mean, this is a multi-billion-dollar, maybe probably trillion-dollar global problem in terms of being able to articulate skills across learning and employment.
Yeah, so one of the questions we had contemplated was, like, what are the challenges facing the skills-based recognition space? And correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems as though this connecting those skills to employment, is that the biggest one? Are there other ones beyond? I've got to think there are other ones beyond that, but is there, what are, kind of unpack that for me. Is this the biggest one? Or if not, which ones are?
I mean, I would say this is definitely a big one. I think there are others out there. I mean, Credential Engine, Deb's organization, has identified like almost a million different credentials that are out there. And so there are credentials that are recognizing skills, but I do think there's a trust factor out there in terms of really acknowledging, okay, this individual has this credential. What does this credential mean? How is it clear? How do I know they really have the skills? Can they demonstrate competency in these areas? So I think that's one really big one. I think, and so I also, and so that's related back to what Deb's talking about, and what Credential Engine is doing is creating the transparency of all of this. And that's what you're definitely pushing out there. And it's so important to have that transparency. And I think it's growing, but I do think there still is some thinking it could be sort of partially habit as well. And folks not really knowing where to go, like employers not knowing where to go to really understand how to be sure that folks have these skills that are coming out of these credentials, and what does that mean? So I think that's another big concern.
Yeah, the trust factor I think is interesting, and you kind of indicated like the familiarity. There is trust in the degree, maybe like a level down. There's trust in a certificate because of a familiarity. I also have one, right? Like maybe like I've kind of seen that, whereas maybe I'm not as familiar with a skills-based credential, and therefore that trust and familiarity isn't as ingrained culturally in the hiring space. And so there's work that's got to be done there. That's really interesting. Deb, how about you?
Yeah, well, let me give an explicit call to action for all the registrars and their associated staff and decision makers, because registrars are trusted entities, right? And so I think they're also very powerful players in this space, unfortunately to block, but let's not do that. Let's say registrars are incredibly powerful players to embrace transparency and to say, look, at our institution, we expect to be able to make a lot of metadata about our many different types of credentials publicly available, including what skills are in them. So someone can understand, well, this certificate stacks to a degree. This certificate isn't intended to stack to a degree, it's intended to prepare for a certification. To literally show those things, preferably in CTDL, but to be that trusted party with much more detailed information that isn't like a course code and a grade, because that's not going to help someone get a job.
Yeah, FREN.
Help someone in general. It's not just about jobs. It's not going to help someone in general, right? So what is going to help people?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, even the ability, Melissa, you kind of indicated this earlier, the ability for learners to be able to reflect on the learning that they've had and recognize in themselves, this is something that I've done, this is something that I've accomplished. There's something very meaningful about that, just as a person, to be aware of the things that you've done and the skills that you have from a motivation perspective, the psychology of that.
Yeah, having the language to be able to communicate this, I think is just so important, and to make those connections. And not just say from your credential, from your degree, but from the volunteer experience you have, from being home, staying home, taking care of an ill family member, or as a parent, and being able to recognize, and as I said, have that language to be able to talk about, I can do this, and I've been able to demonstrate that I can do this. I just think is really important. And I think skills and competencies and that language around that is just really crucial to help folks really leverage what it is that what their abilities are and how they can be applied in different circumstances.
Yeah.
They can be contextualized, really, is a lot of that, right?
Opportunity at Work found that up to 30 million American workers have the skills to earn up to 70% more in pay. That is just an unfathomable statistic. When I just think about what that actually means. Like you and like those listening in, I have friends. You have friends that probably fall into that category. And so when I think about that on a personal basis, and then I think about that generally from a societal perspective, they don't necessarily know that they qualify for that and don't have the credentials to match those job requirements. In your experience, what tangible steps can we take? And maybe, Deb, this gets to your call to action for registrars, but beyond that call to action for registrars and their staff, what can we take to help those learners increase that earning potential? And either of you
Yeah,
can jump in.
so an Opportunity at Work has a really awesome campaign on this called Glass, tear the paper ceiling, which is like, you know, if the degree is what's blocking people from being able to move up, let's just rip it out of there. And some registrars or others in higher ed institutions might find that threatening, but don't embrace it. Because the thing is, instead of saying, okay, well, we're serving these students who are going to get these degrees, say, we're serving these people who are learning these skills all through their educational journey, right? Mm-hmm. So to credential as much as possible. And I realize this has a profound effect on processes and systems, but if possible, credential every single competency, every course completion, break things down into certificates, issue badges that are various sizes and shapes of different skill sets earned in different contexts. Because, you know, it would have been impractical to do that a decade ago before we had open badges and other technologies. Like Parchment has been in the transcript space for a long time, and that's very stable, but there's so much more opportunity for digital credentials. Mm-hmm. So anything that we can give to people to help them understand their own competencies, increasingly there are systems that will say, give me your 500 badges. I don't care how many you have, put them in a wallet, give them to the system. The system's going to help you understand what skills you have and how they map, not just to specific jobs, but to entire career pathways.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you have examples, some examples of those systems that are doing that? I think that'd be very relevant to those early things.
Yeah, well, I kind of prefer not to
list
specific vendors on a call like this, because there's a lot of good work going on in this field. But let me point you to the JFF Plugfest. So Jobs for the Future just completed a Plugfest where verifiable credential wallet providers worked with verifiable credential issuers, and they showed interoperability across wallets and issued credentials. And there's a whole suite of different organizations and companies in that space doing that type of work.
And JFF is a great kind of organizing group around that, as you noted with Plugfest. Melissa, did you have anything that you want to hit on with Opportunity at Work?
I do. I mean, a couple of different things. So I wholeheartedly support what Deb was saying about credentialing everything. And we actually, through Credential As You Go, have a whole framework for sort of looking at different kinds of incremental credentials and how you embed credentials in different certifications and provide credit for prior learning and build stackable credentials. So there's that piece of it. But, you know, the ecosystem is also made up of employers in the workforce system, right? And so on the employer side, I mean, the more that we can just encourage and advance this concept of skills-based hiring, I think thanks, Deb. I think it really, this idea that it opens up the recruiting field and eligible individuals who have these skills, if you kind of remove the degree, as we were talking about before, and really focus in on the skills. I think also with all kinds of organizations and workforce organizations that are supporting this group of folks who are not degreed but are very capable and very skilled, to also work with them on encouraging them to devise and develop their skills-based profiles, as Deb was describing, with the digital wallets and the learning and employment records, and making sure, again, that these individuals really understand and know and have that language that they can incorporate into their profiles, into their resumes as they're reaching out. So that's what I would add to the conversation.
I'm really glad you brought us back to the equity point, Melissa.
Yes.
Because Kevin, I just co-opted your moderator.
Oh, this is your guys' show. Keep going.
Skills-based hiring and helping people be able to communicate their competencies can improve equitable outcomes.
Absolutely.
No guarantee that it will. And so it's important every step along the way that we're using inclusive design principles, that we're thinking about the wide variety of people and their capabilities in terms of being ready, able, and willing to use these new technologies.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, Digital Promise has done some really good work on inclusive design. JFF has, a ton of resources on this front. We have an equity council that's helping us define the key types of information that need to be represented in CTDL to provide more transparency about the equity of different types of credentials and learning opportunities. So there is no simple answer to how to make these processes more equitable, but there is a huge opportunity because employers need people with these skills, and they're not finding them when they just chop it off at everyone who has a degree. So
In the spirit of switching roles, Deb, a thing that has struck me is when you think about historically, and I got to be careful how I say this, and also acknowledge like who I am. You think about the people that historically have gone to college and university and have had the opportunity to do that versus those who have not, and where employers historically have recruited from as a consequence of colleges and universities and degree attainment and all those things. You start to see trends and divergences happen, and how education is positively transformational for the lives of individuals, but not everybody has got to participate at a consistent rate in that transformational experience, and how recognizing individuals for skills and competencies can begin to bring those things back together. It seems to me that is something that should motivate all of us in a pretty meaningful way to help bridge that divide and bring that divide a little closer together, or all the way back together if we can accomplish that. But I don't know if that resonates. Melissa, with just your work and your organization and its particular focus on the equity question, I'm really interested in what your thoughts are there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, so the big concern, I would say, that is raised often is that we want to be really careful that we're not creating two tracks, and we're not perpetuating this idea of different pathways for different people. And so the idea, from our perspective at CSW and at Credential As You Go, is this concept that completely rethinking the credentialing ecosystem so that it is a fair system across the board. It doesn't matter if you have a degree, or you build into the degree, or you do it pieces at a time. And I think we just have to acknowledge and recognize who our student population and our learner population is these days. It's the majority of our higher ed learners are no longer the 18 to 24-year-olds, right? I mean, there's so many adults out there that are coming with skills. They need to add on, they need to reskill. And so acknowledging the circumstances where we are today and looking at the labor market moving forward, it's just so important. I think it lifts all boats, right? If
Yep.
we are focused in on recognizing skills and credentialing skills and building that in, and I have nothing against degrees. I think, that's a path too, but we have to just really make sure that we're very thoughtful about how we push forward on credentialing and recognizing skills so that we have an equal playing field. So that was all over the place, but that's kind of the perspective that I would come from.
Yeah, though I think it's a good word, and Deb, you really emphasize the word can. Like, it doesn't mean that it will, though, and so it's going to take very intentional effort on the part of folks like each of us on this call, but those that are listening and those that will listen to the recording later on to be, and those that don't, to be really intentional about it. Deb, you've provided us some tremendous sources of information around the skills-based discussion, credentialing skills, the connection between skills and employment. Are there any others for those that are listening in that either of you would like to share or highlight beyond what you've already shared? And I'll look to our colleagues who are not moderating, but kind of facilitating this webinar to maybe collect what Deb has shared and put that out for folks to be able to look at later on.
I'll say a word about this initiative from the National Governors Association, and it's about a cohort of states that are working together on skills-based practices and digital learning and employment records. And this is not only really important work, because if a lot of the shift to skills-based processes can happen at the state level via state agencies like the State Department of Education, which can be higher ed and K-12 and CTE, and State Department of Labor and Workforce Development, state licensing. So if you've got a good data transparency processes in those types of agencies, and that's actually one of Credential Engine's primary focuses, is working with state agencies. And then that becomes facilitating for a lot of the other organizations in the state, in terms of the education institutions don't have to do this heavy lifting if there's already, as Melissa described, for example, in Alabama, a state overlay of this type of work that they can slot into. And then that page is also just has a collection of a lot of different resources on these related topics.
Yeah, just one other, I totally, agree. And one other, we're actually being launched tomorrow, and so I don't have the website yet, is a learn and work ecosystem library that is actually sort of a sister to Credential as You Go, whereby it's a wiki model, but it's a set of resources related to all sorts of topics related to higher education, to incremental credentialing, to competencies and skills in all of this discussion. So be able to follow up with more shortly on this, and be looking for an announcement about that, and we can get that to ACRO so that they can share with the folks on this who are listening in.
Another point about states that occurred to me also as Melissa was saying that is, it's really a shout out to Parchment. It's not just because you guys are on the webinar, but because when solution providers can make it easier to bridge from current processes into new processes, right? Oh, well, digital credentials are transcripts. Well, digital credentials are also certificates, they're also badges, etc. And then when you combine that with the solution provider, product and service providers, who can make it easier to accomplish that. And then in a lot of cases, there's actually state help on that front too, because there can be state funding to facilitate this work. And to say, look, institutions, you don't need to puzzle over this. here's a blanket way of doing it, and then all the institutions in the state are going to work together, or all the institutions of a particular type are going to work together even across state lines, etc. So kudos to Parchment for making that a lot easier for everyone.
Well, it's very kind, Deb. We've all got a limited amount of time, and this is an exciting space for us to be able to spend our time on. So we're pumped about it and the impact that it can have on people. I wish that I could see around corners. I do not have that ability. I like to act like I do sometimes, though, if we all know one another enough. But that being said, what do you see coming in the next year in this space? If we kind of break apart, there's this place that we're going to, this journey that we're on. In the next year of this journey, what are some of the meaningful transformations that you foresee happening, without giving it away necessarily, any proprietary plans or anything like that's happening?
Well, one place, and Deb, you already raised this a bit, but I do think, when you talked about sort of the NGA group of states that are working on these digital wallets and learning and employment records, I think more and more those are being developed, created, moving, and I think it's going to move this space, and Parchment's involvement in this, and credential engines as well. I just think that that's going to have a huge impact on advancing this agenda around focusing in on skills. I do think more and more, as there are more stories to be told around all of this work, I feel like having the data is important, having the tools are important, but I really feel like having the stories to tell can really push the messaging out, and the more stories, and I think more and more we're getting stories, positive stories about credentialing skills, about skills-based hiring. And the more we're learning about this, I think the greater adoption. So those are just a couple of things that come to mind when I think about this.
Yeah, so in that NGA cohort, you can expect that at least a few states are going to start working with digital verifiable credentials, and including things like identity credentials at the state level at scale in 2023. And that sounds really fast. It is really fast. We're seeing this work progress faster than we have in my career. So I think once even a handful of states have even partial examples that they can tell success stories about, of where they connected education and training with digital credentials that people can hold and manage themselves, that include helping them understand their own skills, actual skill statements that are then in demand for employers and in demand careers in general in the state or region. So once you start seeing those flows, and it's not a one-way flow, right? Because people need to go back and reskill, and they have continuing education credits they need to get, et cetera, right? So yep. I think we're going to see a growing awareness among all stakeholders that digital credentials that include skills are a real thing. And we're having a lot of success in terms of communicating why it's important to put meaningful information inside those digital credentials. And if you include CTDL in a reference to data that's in the registry, then it becomes actually a graph of additional opportunities that are all connected to those credentials. These are technologies that didn't exist 5 years ago. So it's a huge opportunity now in terms of where this can go.
Yeah, when I think about the transformation from a technology perspective on the technology provider side that has happened in the last 5 years, just to think about what the next year is going to bring is pretty meaningful. In the last few minutes that we have, those that work with me more than others know that I have a lot of blind spots. What questions that I did not ask that you wish that we had talked about, if there are any? And the same for the audience. If you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat and we'll hopefully get to them.
Badges and certificates. Oh, wow. Okay, let me see if I can do this very concisely. So open badges are an open standard digital credential, and they can include any type of achievement. So you can put a credential of a single skill inside a badge or an entire degree, for example. So a badge is a container, and a certificate is a typically smaller than degree credential that is not renewable or revocable like a certification. There's a difference between certificates and certifications. And certificates are useful because they're often much more targeted than a longer term credential like a degree.
Yeah, and often they're usually sort of a group of skills or competencies that are combined together to create the certificate. And often, although not always, sometimes they're standalone, sometimes they will stack into other credentials.
Very good question, Aaron. Thank you. Other questions that folks have? Or Deb and Melissa, questions that we didn't get to that you were hoping that we'd hit on? We've covered a lot of ground this afternoon.
We covered a lot of ground.
Yeah,
I want to hear what other questions the audience has.
right.
Yeah.
I want to know what registrars and admission officers see as some of the key challenges and barriers and how we can tackle them together.
Verification.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so verification, most verifications now occur, via a phone call or background check or some other, at least semi-manual, labor-intensive, expensive process.
Mm-hmm.
But this is another example of how these technologies are changing very quickly, because they're now kind of like digital stamps that go on these digital credentials that can provide immediate verification. And so that's a huge breakthrough.
Yeah. I think one of the other ways, and Lacey Jane, I'm not sure if this is where you were also going with verification, is there's a well-worn process for verifying the courses and grades that go into an academic transcript, but verifying skills, verifying competencies, verifying the inputs that would go into these other credential types is still fairly novel as a scalable process for institutions. Yes. Whereas you've got roughly 100 years plus under your belt of doing that for an academic transcript or a degree.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I think there's a lot of, this is a conversation that we have with institutions around that as well. I think there's a lot of work to be done there. Well, I'm just looking at the time, and we are right at time. So I do want to thank Melissa and Deb for both their preparation for this, and then also their participation in it, and also ACRO for hosting and facilitating this conversation, and each of you for joining. We hope to see you again soon at another webinar. I would be remiss, and my colleagues will come after me if I don't just share a slide with you on next steps from here. If I go back at one, if you do have any questions for us at Parchment, we're happy to answer those. I would encourage you to sign up for our blog, where we do put out some messaging around this. And again, Parchment is very interested in this space and supporting your institutions. So if you do have questions, feel free to reach out. We hope you have a wonderful day and a great month of December and the remainder of the year. And we'll talk to you again soon. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.